the series, as you may know, will be represented by editorial members of Indelible, which is the literary journal of the university. We're excited to be hosting special guests. And tonight we have 3 special guests from different parts of the world. So Dublin, London, and Toronto. Just to briefly introduce myself, I will be the host for tonight. I'm Rula Maria Deeb, professor of English at the American University in Dubai and editor-in-chief of Indelible, the literary journal. First of all, I just want to make sure of a few things with you. Please keep your mics muted during the talk in order to avoid any interfering background noise. Please save the questions for the Q&A session and leave the questions in the chat box until you are invited to use your microphone. Other than that, you are free to use any of the other functions like the hand clapping or the hand raising whenever needed. Okay, so many of you might know what ekphrasis is, more or less. First of all, I'll just briefly introduce it. It comes from the Greek word which means description. And ekphrastic poetry is when poems vividly describe a work of art through verse, transforming and translating it from one medium to another. It is often described as a form of art about art. And this imaginative act of contemplation retells and imitates the visual representation of painting, sculpture, or photography into verse. It amplifies and expands the meaning of the work of art. The ekphrastic poet may have an emotional engagement with a work of art, or a direct address to it, or might want to symbolically interpret it, personify it, or simply add dimensions to a work of art through writing poetry. I will now introduce our guests. First of all, welcome to our virtual studio, Chris, Laurette, and Selma. Laurette Lusajic is an award-winning mixed media artist whose collage paintings have been shown in galleries, museums, restaurants, banks, cafes, hotels, laundromats, billboards, reality TV, a magazine ad, and more. Her work has been collected at home in Canada and in at least 25 countries around the world: the USA, France, Italy, Belgium, Germany, Tunisia, Peru, Mexico, Estonia, South Africa, the Netherlands, England, Austria, Scotland, and more. Laurette is also a widely published writer whose poetry and prose has appeared in several hundred literary journals in print and online, and more than a dozen anthologies. She has been nominated 3 times for the Pushcart Prize and twice for Best of the Net, one making it to the finalists. She has written 5 collections of poetry, 2 of them entirely ekphrastic, meaning poems responding to visual art. She is the founder and editor of the Ekphrastic Review, a journal devoted entirely to creative writing inspired by art. And now, Chris Murray. Chris Murray is an Irish poet and feminist who works to improve the visibility of women writers. She graduated from the University College Dublin with a degree in art history and English literature. She also completed a diploma in web development from the National College of Ireland. She qualified as a stonecutter and has worked with the Office of Public Works in Ireland, where she does restoration stonework, mostly in Limerick and Kerry. 2 historic sites she has worked on are Ross Castle and Ardfert Cathedral in County Kerry. Murray writes poetry predominantly for publication, though she has done performance poetry. In 2012, at the Bale Festival of New Music and Poetry, her lament for 3 women's voices was performed. She's on the PEN International Women Writers Committee and the social media coordinator for Irish PEN. She founded Poethead, which is dedicated to women writers, and she's a member of FIRED, Irish Women Poets, and the Canon. And last but certainly not least, Salma Ahmed Kaller. Selma is an Egyptian-British artist and art historian who was born in Iraq and grew up in Nigeria and Saudi Arabia. She now lives in the UK. Selma's art practice involves creating an imagery of the narratives of body that have shaped her own body and identity across profound cultural divides. Her work is strongly visual, but also incorporates text and sound works. It is an investigation of the painful and contradictory mythologies surrounding the female body, processes of exoticization, and the legacy of colonialism as a cross-generational transmission of ideas, traumas, bodies, and misconceptions. Her art practice is informed by a master's in art history and theory, having studied medicine, and teaching cross-cultural perspectives at Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. I would like to welcome the three of you. And before I give you the floor, I would like to ask a question that the three of you might want to answer. First of all, what role does ekphrasis play in your life? Or in other words, how ekphrastic are you? So maybe we do this alphabetically. So we'd start first with Chris.
Okay, I'm primarily a textual poet, and but as I began to work with Salma, and also from the imagist perspective, I began to realize that my work is very constructed, and the composition of my work would use elements light as an actor or a character in the poem, texture. I use very limited color palette. I use colors symbolically. When you read my poems, like the most recent of them would use maybe a palette of 3 primary colors or 2 colors from the light spectrum, primarily amber and indigo. So I suppose that I construct the poem and I layer it. And I began to look at poetry that would lend itself to ekphrasis. And these are poems that would have space within them to allow the reader to inhabit them. So to me, ekphrastic poetry works, or ekphrasis works very well with haiku, haibun, imagist work, elegiac work, homiletic and or religious work, but it doesn't work in terms of the narrative poem, because you're being taken where you stand within the poem. There's not a lot of space. I'm open for that to be debated, but I feel that poems with space around them that allow you to come in and respond to it, or demand a response, are more ekphrastic to me. They're more open to ekphrasis. And I just wanted, there were 2 things I wanted to say about it, because I know that we're working with visual artists and poets today. And one of the things was, I feel that we should be able to expand the notion of ekphrasis to include translatory response, because I've actually seen that done very well by Yvonne Boland, where she contemporized a medieval poem. And when she did that, she very definitely responded to it as an object of art in her translation. And the other thing I wanted to say was that really ekphrasis encompasses the visual, the oral, film, and translatory response to poetry. So it's a wider field than maybe sometimes we have narrowed it a little in order for, we say poet responds to art, but in fact it can be whole fields of art responding to poetry as well. So if that makes sense. So it's for me, the imagist poem is a constructed entity, and it's a composed entity, and it's a layered entity, and it can take weeks and weeks to maybe do 37 or 38 character poem, and to have it ready for publication. because I'm looking for the elements that fit together. So form isn't a huge issue with me. I tend to release and remove anything that gets in the way of the image. So that would be my kind of personal textual response to constructing an imagist poem.
That's beautiful, Chris. Thank you so much. I like the way how you see ekphrasis going both ways. So instead of poetry translating mediums of art, like the visual art, but it also goes the other way around too. And I can particularly relate to the haiku. You mentioned that ekphrasis works pretty well with haiku. And I mean, I believe that my students in the creative writing classroom, they really do a great job writing haikus when I ask them to respond to photography from National Geographic, for example, or to classical paintings. So I can relate to that as well. Thank you, Chris. I will move now to Laurette.
Hi, thanks everyone for coming. I've always been really passionate about art history and curious about the stories of the artists. So it was only natural for me to always be writing about that in one way or another. So I've written biographies of artists in an essay form in a sort of gossipy way. And then I started to get more into a kind of fiction or poetic response and began writing poems, or maybe they could be interpreted as flash fiction. They're often prose poems. So that just seemed natural to me because I'm a writer and an artist, and a lot of my visual artwork is inspired by words or uses poetry as a theme or uses symbols from favorite literature. Some recurring ones might be from the Wind Up Bird Chronicle or The Secret History by Donna Tartt. So there's little hidden symbols from stories that just show up in my art. And so Christine and Rula both mentioned that sort of the back and forth. There's writing about art and art about writing. In a way, art has always been about stories. It was usually religious, and so therefore had some, the mythology of that culture was the main theme of the artwork. And then later in modern art, they started to try to portray poetry, like Robert Motherwell and Anthony Tapies. They were trying to convey poetic gesture. So I think the two forms often go together, and that was just very natural for me on both sides of that. So I started the Ekphrastic Review 5 years ago with the intention that it just be a space online for me to put some thoughts and maybe find some poems from other writers. It wasn't going to be this journal that has grown exponentially in those years. It was a surprise to me that there were so many others out there, and here we are now, all of us together from all over the world. So I find that very exciting.
Thank you so much, Laurette. I really love the way how you relate art to stories. So ekphrasis is also about the story behind the painting, or the story that the painting would tell, that would make you experience it. I'm not sure I'm correct, but I believe my first submission to the Ekphrastic Review was also a story, about a story that I found in Bronzino's Venus and Cupid. I was at the National Gallery in London, and then, you know, it just spoke to me. I couldn't understand it. It was very enigmatic. It was one of the most enigmatic paintings that I found there. And, you know, it's this response, it's this personal translation sometimes. So thank you, Laurette. You speak to us. And Selma, the floor
Hi,
is...
everyone. Thank you, Rula, for having us here. So, to be honest, I never really considered myself ekphrastic exactly. I didn't really think about it in that way. I think that you mentioned to everyone at the beginning that I grew up abroad in Africa and the Middle East. And I came to the UK in 1990, and I studied art history and theory as a kind of change from medicine. But actually, I spent many years studying physiology, anatomy, biology, all the processes of the body. And I think for me, art and writing have somehow just always evolved together. And I've never seen, and this is probably going to feed into one of the questions that you're going to ask me later, that image and word are not separate for me. So when I'm working on a piece of artwork, it could be that I start the process of preparing what I'm going to create by kind of investigating those images in my head and then writing. And for me, those images in my head are not flat things, they're multi-sensory things with textures, shapes, feelings. And I'll be looking and writing down words that for me have sounds, feelings, and textures as well. And that kind of connects the concepts for me together. And then I go back and forth between creating the actual physical visual work. I do a lot of collage, so choosing which images I'm going to cut and what kind of forms and sensations. So I feel like for me, art is the visual aspect and the writing aspect is a part of a continuum with my body and how I comprehend the world. And I think that a lot of people know this word synesthesia, where they think it's either an illness or just something that crazy artist people have. But actually the senses of our body are not that separate. So we're not just seeing. When we're seeing, we're touching and feeling, etc., and vice versa. So I think sometimes when I'm using ekphrasis, I'm trying to describe a feeling, which also somehow turns into describing a texture or a form or a shape. And for me, it's all very interconnected and related. So I think that, you know, sometimes I'll end up writing a poem because it just came out that way. I write a bunch of words on a piece of paper, and, you know, sometimes it looks like a poem and sometimes not. And that's, you know, how it evolves. And sometimes I submit or exhibit work with the writing, because I think there's a dialogue between the two, a kind of formation, a revelation of formation that happens about the word image relationship. Or sometimes people never see what it is that I've written, but they're inseparable as part of my art practice.
And your artwork has also been featured on poetry book covers, like Chris's poetry book, and in poetry platforms like Poethead as well. So you tend to speak to poetry through your art as well. And it's really interesting how ekphrasis for you might not only be a dialogue between two mediums of art, but can you see it as a dialogue between disciplines? So you mentioned that the body is the common factor. So the body in art, the body in medicine. You studied medicine, you studied art history, and you were able to make this connection between the disciplines as well.
Yes, I think that one of the first things that, you know, used to make me laugh when I was studying art history is that somehow if you're studying one field without knowing something else, then you don't realize how much you don't know. For example, if people are talking about anatomy or sensations or aesthetics, but then actually knowing how the body works gives you a really different perspective. And I think that later on I'll be talking about why we separate word and image, and why I think that's kind of problematic, but also useful, and how ekphrasis can help break down that actual separation of word and image. And the fact that the body and its senses, and how we create visual imagery, whether that's imagery in a poem or imagery in an artwork, is very visceral. And people don't often think this, but actually making art and creating visual images and writing poetry is a form of cognition. It's a form of thinking. It's a form of working things out. And I think often we think of this as this sort of removed, art world, poetic world. But actually, we've got however many millions of evolutionary years behind human beings. And actually, what we're doing in both poetry and art and so many other things like having a tea party is something called making special, where we create an aura or a ritualistic special aura around what it is that we're doing, so that we can create meaning out of the chaos and all the inputs that our body is receiving. That's how it kind of untangles all the mess and figures out what matters to you, how, and it's actually survival as well, inextricable from survival. So physiology and art are actually pretty inseparable.
Yeah, we have Leonardo da Vinci, for example. He was very anatomical sometimes in his sketches, and he was an artist as well. So he drew the body. He tested the body through his drawings as well. So he was
Yes, and he understood about forces and pressures and
right.
yes, and
Well, thank you so much, Sedma.
balance.
That was a beautiful and enlightening explanation of what you do. I'm going to move back to Chris. Chris, is there any analogous relationship between stone cutting and writing poetry, knowing that you are a certified stonecutter?
Yes. Firstly, I was a conservation stonecutter, so we were working with existent structures. So I was working with huge, massive pieces of masonry. So I suppose the basis of architectural masonry is linearity, and it's also geometry. So to kind of illustrate that, if I was creating a sphere from a cuboid or a cube shape, we actually circled the square. So we would use a revolving, we used medieval techniques. I learned everything like in hands, like everything by hand. So we would use a revolving hexagonal to create a circular or sphere shape. And when we were, so if you visualize the block of stone with a revolving hexagonal at either end of it, what you're doing is you're projecting point to point until the shape emerges, and that you're removing the surface. So it starts off as a kind of sorry. It starts off as a block and ends up as a circle through processes of geometry and linearity. So the other thing about it is that you have to be very visual. You have to be able to project. You have to be able to project across like vast distances. I would be creating a church window, which would be mullioned, and they rise up and they branch out, and you can't have anything wrong with it aerodynamically because it creates downward pressure, upward pressure, and sideward pressure. So you also become very tactile. So I suppose I brought with me from stone cutting this high visualization and this and tactility. And the other thing was we had to learn how to break blocks of stone through using sound techniques. Well, not sound, yes, sound. So if we were to break a massive block of stone, we would place pegs at intervals, and we'd hammer them with a certain beat and rhythm. And you do it for a few minutes and the stone falls apart because you're creating a crack through the surface of the stone. So I think I've brought a lot of that into my writing, especially in terms of how I visualize a poem from start to finish, because they're never simple. They're always constructions. They're always architecturalized. There might be a recent example is I did a whole notebook on a pot of lilies, and one poem emerged, and I'd be observing every day changes in the light or changes in the way they behaved towards sun or water, and one poem emerged from it. So it's labor intensive, and it can take weeks to finish a poem because I might need a very specific phrase to complete it, or to turn it around, or to reverse its intention. So I do a lot of experimentation. So yeah, I would bring a lot of the discipline and the way I visualize something from start to finish into my work. Yeah, if that makes sense. It's very they're large physical objects, so it would be very hard to explain them, but they weren't sculptural. It wasn't an artistic job. It was a massive architectural and geometrical job that conserved existing structures, so it had to be right. So I'd always be working with conservation archaeologists and architects, and you couldn't get one thing wrong. So you had to rely on your eye and your hands to make sure that what you were putting in place was correct. And I think I have that still. I still have that tension when I'm putting a poem in a book, that it's right and that it works with the other poems, and that the undercurrent of the unity of the team and the way the poems work off each other, it has to be right for me, or it just feels wrong, if that makes sense. So that's I brought a lot of discipline with me, in short.
It's a very interesting connection, especially when you don't regard stone cutting as an artistic process, but you could still see the analogy with writing poetry. So thank you, Chris. I'm going to move again now to Laurette. And Laurette, I'm going to ask you, how do you find the ekphrastic approach to benefit writers?
So Selma touched on this when she said that writing is thinking. And when we contemplate a work of art, I think that's the best way to learn more about how to appreciate it, or what the artist was saying is you can observe the artwork with more patience than you might at a museum, and really have a chance to clarify your responses, why you like it or don't like it. You kind of have a chance to sit with that and see where you stand, and maybe a memory is triggered that you could write about, or you might describe it, or you might do a bit of archaeology and dig up some interesting tidbits of the artist's life. So it's a really excellent way to approach learning about other people's perspective or their historical time or culture, because art really brings us through all times and through all different countries and places. So it connects us with others. I think that's the most important thing, is it helps a writer step outside of him or herself and just be able to look more carefully. So there's also the fact that you would never run out. There are literally millions. Most ekphrastic writers will sort of take up a prompt when they're drawn to a work of art. They love something and they have something to say about it. But a whole different exercise is using a prompt or something random. So if someone, we have, for example, bi-weekly challenges, and some of our writers will send something every time because they want to try writing even about the ones they weren't drawn to or didn't like, because that will bring a very different kind of writing or kind of response. So that's just as interesting as the ones that have a deep emotional resonance, I think. Let me just skim my notes if I missed anything. So also the art can be therapeutic, and it is a way of processing deep emotions. So that's another approach. Maybe not as intellectual or as biographical about the artist, but it's about us. So if we want to process big questions, things about life and death and war or grief, love, ecology, I mean, art is a way into all of those things. And by writing about them, we have a chance again to process our feelings and understand that other people have their perspectives or their responses to them that may or may not match with ours. So it connects us to those who are going through the same things, and also in a kind of bigger or more cosmic way, if you will, the just examining the big questions, how other people have done so. So those are a few of the things. I mean, you'll just never have writer's block again once you get hooked on doing this.
That's true. And I really love the empathy factor / tolerance factor that you just mentioned, how you get to see, and maybe in a way you kind of participate in the experiences of others. There's this notion of participation mystique, the identification with the object of art, which I also think that you've kind of touched upon right now. It's very interesting, Laurette, how the way you speak about art, the way you speak about ekphrasis shows the necessity of art in our lives, not just a new style of writing or a different style of writing about poetry, about painting. I mean, but this is something that we all need. We need this dialogue between mediums, just as we need the dialogue between different perspectives. So thank you.
Thank you.
Selma, I want to ask you about the separation between word and image. I mean, why? Why this big bang? Why the separation? Word from image.
Yes, I think, well, actually, I'm going to read you guys a poem, not mine, but when you first invited me to join this discussion, that was the first thing that entered my head. Why are we doing this? Why are we talking about painting and poetry? What about everything else? What about dance? What about music? What about photographs? What about singing? What about rolling around in the sandpit? What is this? What about cooking in the kitchen? So what is this specific kind of thing called painting and poetry that we have? And obviously what is then image and word? And then what is this sight versus language separation? And I think that for me, part of my work is kind of decolonization of structures and ways that we think, and try to kind of unpick some of those kind of foundations of what it is we're thinking, came from the fact that when I moved here and started studying art history, none of this made sense. When people said image, representation, symbol, object, optical, I was like, what are they talking about? With my background in medicine, it's like, what are they going on about? What about sound? What about smell? What about touch? What about vibration? What about heat? So I think that questioning the separation of word and image is important, because it's at the root of some problematic ideas about the role that the body plays in the construction of meaning. And we perhaps don't even realize that the role of the body in the construction of meaning, and how it's been left out in a sort of European, North American kind of knowledge formations and art history canons. is that there tends to be this separation, and where the I is more important for critical thought, or thought to be more important for critical thought and discernment and figuring out ideas and language. So there's this idea of objective, detached, rational, masculine and patriarchal versus emotional, carnal, subjective, female body hidden in this structure of painting versus poetry that we're kind of going along with if we're not careful, and that we're already speaking from within a certain field brings with it a pile of assumptions. But I'm going to, so from my point of view, as I spoke about earlier about synesthesia and embodiment, that word and image to me are almost the same, or within the same kind of matrix. But I want to just quickly read you a poem by Hilda Doolittle, known as HD, and she's trying to ekphrastically describe an object, and really it just brings everything. So she's struggling to find the words to describe this object. What is the dual color, green, white, opalescent, with underlayer of changing blue, with rose vein and white agate, with a pulse uncooled that beats yet, faint blue-violet. It lives, it breathes, it gives off fragrance. I do not know what it gives, a vibration that we cannot name, for there is no name for it. My patron said, name it. I said, I cannot name it, there is no name. He said, invent it. I cannot invent it. I said it was agate. I said it lived, it gave fragrance, was near enough to explain that quality for which there is no name. I do not want to name it. I want to watch its faint heartbeat, pulse, beat, as it quivers. I do not want to talk about it. I want to minimize thought, concentrate on it till I shrink, dematerialize, and am drawn into it. So I felt that this poem really hits the nail on the head, that she's, so that the downside, you could say, of ekphrasis and trying to put everything into words is that you can't, and you shouldn't be, because a lot of what we know, you could say, a lot of what we know is unconscious or subconscious. It's not that we shouldn't try, and it's not extremely illuminating and rewarding to try to find and describe what we're feeling, what we can draw out of seeing an object or an art object or a thing. But also the way she uses so many words like heartbeat, pulse, fragrance, and that this thing is living. It's not really a thing after all. It's living, and I think that for me that's really important. We, as I was saying earlier, we know far more than we can put into words, because things come before thoughts, and people often think that you can't understand something unless you can put it into words, but actually the way your body works is it's understood something before you can put it into words, and it knows a lot more before you've figured out what it is that you're trying to say, if you even ever do. And it's because what we know is mostly not accessible to non-figurative language. To some extent, figurative language like poetry can convey meaning indirectly into our bodies and subconscious via metaphor. A lot of people don't really get what metaphor is. They think it's words, but what we know is metaphor. Everything that we understand is metaphorized by the body to understand it. For example, how do we understand empty? Empty isn't a word, empty is a feeling. And because we know what's empty, we look in our cup and it's empty, and we have an idea of something is missing. So we can't separate what we understand and the words that we use from the physical understanding that we had since we were a child, or an earthworm kind of sliding over everything, and those physical sensations of understanding. So physiology, the limbic system, the emotions, the imagination all take part in images and words. And it's a kind of continuum of metaphor making. That's why words like image, visual, and optical representation are problems, because, for example, music, do we say that music represents our emotions? stands in for. No, I think we say music is feeling. We're feeling directly through our bodies. The music is something that we're feeling. And I think that then why should we say images, be they painterly drawn, photographic, or imagistic words in poetry, are symbolic or representational? Is there any difference in how the potent feelings and meanings of imagery, arise like music, instantaneous understanding that's transmitted straight into your body? It's not a representation. It is what we feel and think. So I think that in Western hierarchies, there's often an idea of primacy of language and visual order over everything else. But when you start to bring the body back in, then everything starts to fall apart somewhat, this separation of word and image. And just to finish off, in many African cultures, poetry is spoken word. And so on top of the physiological understandings, there are things like the cadence and the lilt of the voice and the inflection, the timbre, the vibration, the melody, the rhythm, the flow. When someone's voice moves you, it feels like it's actually touching you. So I think that there's a lot of bringing the body back in that can help us understand what image is and what poetry is. And the fact that when we look at images or read poetry, we're not just feeling feelings or thinking thoughts or processing information. We're having bodily meaning transmitted into us from the painting and the words, in immediacy. So that aesthetic meaning in things is living. It's not a representation after all.
That was beautiful, Sedma. You just reminded me of M.M. Blattner's concept of the ear con. So icon and ear con. Why can't we have auditory symbols the same way we have visual symbols? It's very interesting to hear you talk about it. And plus, you were reading from Trilogy, right?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Well, that's one of my favorite poetry books. And guess what? This is where Indelible got its name from. It got,
really?
Yes, it got its name from the verse that says, "The indelible ink of the palimpsest," from Hilda Doolittle's trilogy. So it's funny having you read from the source of Indelible without knowing.
Without knowing.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. I'm gonna go back now to Chris one more time and ask her. Chris, as editor of Poethead, how often do you receive ekphrastic submissions? And are there any particular patterns that you notice or associate with ekphrastic poems written by women? Or is it just random?
No, I actually don't get a lot of ekphrastic poems. The poems that I tend to get are more responsive to events. They're more about the poet's relationship to language and psychogeography. And I can only actually think of one poem that I received in my 12 years that was ekphrastic. There's probably more, but I mean, it's 12 years and there's a lot of poets, but that was by Susan Miller Dumaris, and it's called Madame Matisse is shown her portrait. I don't know if you know the painting. I don't have a slide. You know the painting, and it's about her reaction to a portrait that he's done of her, and it's horrible. So I suppose it would be the picture, the way she felt about the picture was horrible. So I suppose it would be a feminist and personal response to, the distance in a relationship, or how you realize your other half perceives you, and it's a tragic ekphrastic poem. But so since I don't have a lot to talk about there, I wanted to go back to what Salma was saying about embodiment and sensating and feeling in poetry. And I would describe it, I feel that when I'm writing that I feel it and I embody it more than I use words. It's very hard to find words, which might be why I'm very minimalistic about them and about the color palette. and I understand exactly what Salma is saying in that situation. So no, to go back to that, I don't get ekphrastic and I don't understand why. I get poetry that's in love with language and in response to events, personal or geopolitical or ecological, but I don't get a lot of ekphrasis. So that's basically where it stands. The only one I can think of is Madame Matisse. So I transcribed a bit of it, and the last verse is, why these tears, why this feeling? I'm thinking, portrait of Madame Matisse. Who is she? Henri, my love, my dear old friend, when did you stop seeing me? And that's from her book, The God Thing. And it is the only one that jumps out at me in terms of a poet's response to art on the site. So I'm not querying it. I just think it's unusual where in Laurette's case, she has so much. I had to look at the ekphrastic review and it was very interesting, and at her art before we came on here. But it's not something, I suppose it depends on the kind of site that you run. If your submissions policy is dedicated to ekphrasis, you're going to get ekphrasis. And if it isn't, I suppose mine would be more general. It's about welcoming experiments and welcoming people who do not speak English as first language and welcoming translated poetry. So it would be more language-based submissions on my site. So I can't think of anything else to say on that subject. There are no more.
All going to Laurette's ekphrastic review. Because also at Indelible, we don't get many ekphrastic poems, by the way. So as you said, maybe it's the type of journal. Maybe ekphrastic poets tend to go to ekphrastic journals. So Laurette, I guess that's where, that's the reason why you're most of the time flooded maybe with submissions.
We are. It gets to be more and more that way.
Uh-huh.
I've had to change the submission window from any time to first experimented with month on, month off, and now we've gone down to 4 months of a year. So
Wow.
that I have the other 2 months to catch up. Right now, there's about 400 emails I have to get through with ekphrastic submissions. So it's marvelous, really.
Did you find a connection between the pandemic and the amount of poetry that you're receiving, the amount of ekphrastic poetry, Laurette? Or no, it's probably before that.
I think it goes up every year,
Right.
and that this was no different.
Okay.
Yeah, I do.
All right, interesting. And as editor of the Ekphrastic Review, what are your hopes for the journal's future, for an ekphrastic journal's future, like your journal?
So somehow organically, we have received 85% of our submissions are poetry. So we've kind of become known as a poetry journal. I would hope that somehow we will be able to get more ekphrastic fiction and creative nonfiction as well in the future, and get the readers that are interested in those as well to broaden how many people will view the amazing work of our writers. So I think we've done really well in poetry and attracted the best, amazing talents. We don't get a lot of essays and fiction, and I'm working on trying to attract more of that. And another area we've started growing in is translation. So I'm really privileged to have published some Russian and Portuguese and German and Urdu and Irish so far. And I'd really love to bring the world of ekphrastic writing to the journal. So if it wasn't in English, we would still like to provide the record. And if folks wanted to translate from other languages. We're really having a push for this now, because that means a lot to me, just as a sort of archive of record. And so those are the directions that I hope we expand in as we continue to grow.
Oh, thanks for announcing that. And I do hope that you continue to grow at the same beautiful pace that you are growing in right now.
Thank you.
Senma, I'd like to ask you, what do we mean by metaphor? Interestingly, I don't know. I mean, since you've studied art history, since you are a poet, and since you've also studied medicine, you know how medicine, the earliest forms of medicine started out with the doctrine of signatures. So, for example, a kidney bean was good for your kidneys because it looked like your kidneys. Broccoli is good for your lungs. Look at it, it looks like lungs. Did medicine start as metaphor? Do you see this connection between poetry, medicine, metaphor in a way?
Well, it's interesting to hear you put it like that. And I think certainly in the Renaissance, which is like part of the era that I studied for my art theory and art history and stroke anthropology of art, there was very much this important idea of analogy and similitude. What things, like you said, if things are similar in form, then they're similar in attributes. So if something, like you said, it looks like a kidney, then it might be good for your kidney. But I think for me I started looking into cognitive science and how we understand. And I don't know if you're familiar with the writers Lakoff and Johnson, who wrote a book about metaphor and about the meaning of the body, because I was very interested in finding out what the meaning of the body is, because people keep talking about mind, and the mind is the body. We still seem to think that it's not, but it definitely is. And they try to explain in a really interesting way what metaphor is and how it is part of the structure of how we understand everything. It's inseparable from how a human being understands the world. It's not something written in a sentence. Particularly what's called structural metaphor. Obviously, there are more flowery things that you could call metaphors. And so structural metaphor, so the body makes what's called a schema, which is almost like a sensation map that it plots certain things on. So part of my interest as writing art theory is looking at ornament, because I'm always interested in what has been marginalized in the main art historical narratives and canons. So why is ornament always considered not important, when actually ornament is very much about sensations and viscerality and movement and edges and boundaries and lips and borders, which is actually, if you think of us as kind of earthworms, as I mentioned earlier, crawling around, that's how you figure out the world. There's a lip there, there's an edge. And when you're looking at something visual, a piece of art, or even imagery and poetry, or feeling those shapes and textures. And so the body makes this kind of map. You could say that it's an imprint in your mind from all the things that your body has understood, that helps you understand what a physical shape means, or a texture means, or what a gradation means, say going from dark to light, whether you're upside down or inside out. So a lot of the metaphors we use in language, I'm I feel really empty today, or everything's upside down, or I feel blue. And it isn't, and they explain a lot of this fascinating language. It's because your body has created this map for you, a kind of generalized map that then becomes more specific through all your experiences, that it can then turn into the shape of meaning, so that you can understand it. So everything is, like I said before, everything is metaphorized. So the only way you can understand something conceptually is because your body has already understood it physically. you can't go from you can't have a separate kind of floaty idea up here without your body having understood physically and texturally what something is. And that's how the meaning is generated. So in fact, it's your body that understands things first, and then your mind. And that's what metaphor really is, a structural metaphor. It's materialized meaning. It's quite a complex subject, but hopefully that kind of makes sense. I think the clearest
That's how
example
we
is when I
learn.
use.
I mean, you're referring even to our earliest forms of learning, of associating.
Yes.
This is how
Yes.
children learn. This hurts, this tastes good, this doesn't. So this is
Yes.
how we respond and how we understand
Yes.
things through the way our body takes it.
That's right, and that takes us back to why the limbic system and the emotions are inseparable. You can't actually make a rational thought. You know, this idea of rational objective thinking is nonsense, really. Obviously, you can make a very heated, angry decision and a more cool-headed decision. But at the end of the day, all our decisions are dictated by a physical, visceral understanding of what's safe, what makes me feel good, what makes me feel happy, what's dangerous. You know, what do I want? What is pleasurable? What makes me feel good? And so there's this experience of sensations and emotions that always come together. So, you know, in a really basic, simplistic way, which is one I always go back to, is the empty one. So maybe you felt really disappointed one day when you were a child that your cup was empty. You know, you can't separate those kinds of structural shapes and forms and what's a volume, what's inside something else, and what's outside, and what's flat and what's covering something. And that's kind of a kind of way that structures and physical things metaphorize meaning for us all the way up to really complex things. And nowadays we have metaphors that structure our thinking that are related to the machine. Because since Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, we think that we have this terrible mistake that we all think our brains are computers. And that metaphor, that's the downside of certain metaphorical structural thinking is, and that takes you to what Chris was saying as a stone cutter, and you were saying there were analogies between stone cutting and poetry. I would say there are metaphor creating processes for Chris in cutting stone that have appeared in her poetry, and I feel something very physical when I read Chris's poetry, something very visceral and very shaped. And I think that we don't realize that what we do with our hands and our bodies is what's creating the metaphors through which we think, feel, and structure everything else.
Can I say something?
Of course.
Okay, Salma was saying about embodiment and metaphor. Of course, that's where poems and ekphrasis is coming from. But there's also our separation, like the idea of the mind-body separation is ludicrous, but there's also our separation from our place in the world, which is to me almost psychotic, like our place in nature. If you're looking at I love that HD poem, but if you're looking at the agate and the limb system and the relation of the body to the object, you also have to look at the relation of the body in the world and the landscape that it is part of. Like, I'm never happier. Like sometimes poems, when I'm writing poems, you need to get away, and I don't work as a stonecutter anymore, but I'll be at trees and pruning and hedges and things like that because I have to work with my hands. And I suppose when I'm working with my hands, I'm more aware of our dependence and role, in nature. And I think, I don't know, urbanity and kind of technology has divorced us from that. And it really, concerns me that we don't see ourselves as part of the world. We see ourselves as kind of abstractions. And I suppose when the body gets ill, you become more aware of dependency on and your place in nature, if that makes sense, so, but I don't know. I suppose my point is that like we're part of everything and we're in everything, and like the art we produce is also part of everything and in everything. And this dialogue, this art history dialogue, I also studied art history, Salma, and the nicest, like the best thing and the high point of my study was when we were asked to go into the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin, and they gave us a map and we'd find a painting and we'd sit in front of the painting for an hour, and we then had to go and write about it in any way we wanted, but we weren't allowed to study it. We weren't allowed to know its context, and we weren't allowed to know its like where it fitted into the linearity of art history, which is also a linearity in English literature. And so they were creating in us that kind of ekphrasis and that response. But that was that was the first and last time we did something like that in art history, like a bodily reaction to the work and that knowledge. And after that, we just kind of immersed in theory and theoretical. And I think it took me 4 or 5 years to unlearn everything I had learned academically, and to change the way I use language so that it actually was related to something that, like, it was non-academic, and as Salma says, it's visceral. Like, it's related to the body, and it's related to me, and it's related to what I feel my place is in the world. So it's not theoretical. I don't see poetry as theoretical response, if that makes sense. And thanks so much for hierarchy, Salma, for that
My
painting.
pleasure.
Yeah, no, like I it floored me for weeks, which I never admitted. So that was just my response to that. So I think as a people, like in this very limited globe, that we have to start being more aware of the impact we're making, but also be more aware of how we are living in and using the world, I suppose, ecologically.
Oh, definitely. And I think this is one thing that should definitely and will definitely change after this pandemic is over. Our relationship with our bodies is changing. We are more aware of sickness. We are more aware of hygiene. We are more aware of so many things that we either used to take for granted or we didn't think much of. And I think in turn, with time after that, after our increased bodily awareness, our relationship with the world would also change, with our environment and nature, as you said. So, I mean, here's hoping that there is also this new revived awareness of our place in the natural world. So thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, everybody. I would like to ask if any of you would like to close the session with an ekphrastic poem.
I've got one.
Okay.
Okay, it's short. All my work is short, and it's called Lily Crowded Window, and it's new, so it's still like in process. Her, not breath, mine, signs our presence at the glass. Hers and mine, our presence. Blue milk, the cooling sun plays her opaques, leaf speckles, variegations. Retreat now, she drains into winter's dark work, July begun. She drains north, setting to rest, yellow tips brown, sun held once. Something in secret furls, unfurls, its stem life, a creamy gold lit, fly flicks. So thank you for
Thank
that.
you so much, Chris. Laurette, would you have another poem?
I do, thank you. Do I get one or two?
Well, you can have two. It's fine.
Okay.
Yep. We'll be doing questions, a quick Q&A right after the poems. So everyone, if you've got questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and then we will address them after the poetry session.
Can everybody see this sculpture of David?
Uh-huh.
Yes.
So this short poem is called The Limestone Angel. I saw the angel in the marble and carved until I set him free. Is that Michelangelo's story of David, pale, proud, puer, metamorphic, metaphoric masterpiece? This limestone angel, what was it like to sweep aside the stone and chisel him to life, tentatively, carefully, coaxing him to standing? Did the artist tremble at his touch, contouring calcaneus, maza to mandible, scalpel to sinew, fingertips brushing across the tender loins of the boy who would be king?
Lovely.
My second poem here. Can everyone see this still life with lemons?
Uh-huh.
This poem is called January River. The artist is Peter Klaas. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. You didn't say much, so I did all the talking, chattering about my library books or the clues I'd found in the hollow of the dead tree that bridged the creek with your yard. You would wash the dishes, I would dry, and then we would have tea, black with a splash of citrus. I loved the flush of youth still round on your leather cheeks, and I loved the old blue and white cups we sipped from. While we waited for the water to boil, I would stand in the corridor and get lost in the Dutch still lifes, reproductions framed in dirty yellow gilt. Like the drapery in winter at the lighthouse, the paintings were heavy and distant, but I was drawn to them. They all said there was more buried in you than were gone in that winter river. I waded through the cracking paint and grime to reach for a bruised apple or a pocket watch in the fading light. I understood that the details of your silence were hidden here, among ruddy crustaceans, skinned lemons, the thin curly rind, ribbon as delicate as paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laurette. They were beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Salma?
Yes. Well, actually, I'll just quickly explain. One of the things that we didn't have time to talk about was the relationship of Ekphrasis to the museum, and the fact that in the 19th century, with all the public museums and around the peak of empire, a lot of poets were ekphrastically engaging with art and poetry. And that relationship with the museum is really interesting. And I started a project over the summer, and it's going to be in a book coming out in December called Forms of Migration, where you're exploring cross-cultural, because I'm Egyptian British, I was exploring a cross-cultural identity for a European funded project. And my mother died earlier this year in May, and I was clearing my mother's house and looking at objects, and I realized that I was collecting and creating curating selections of objects and photographs, and then kind of labeling them by writing a label for each of those objects of significance, emotional significance to the memories of my parents, and inserting within those label texts, as I try to just detachedly describe an object, unbidden, all sorts of memories, emotions, and sensations came out. So this is my kind of ekphrastic writing of a label rather than an actual, maybe wouldn't really classify it as a poem. But one of the objects I called Mute White Swan Feather, found while walking through Kew Gardens. A lady swan with her cygnets gathered about her on the bank by the water. She preened and shed several perfect white feathers. The mute white swan is a rare visitor to North Africa. She has uniquely shaped feathers that create sound. As air passes over them, a distinctive humming throb that carries over long distances. An instrument, this feather, for making a note of sound that is a touch from afar. A sound feather. A feather remains long after the body has gone, like hair and nails. She leaves her feathers humming and throbbing in her wake. So that was like an idea of talking in a detached way about something, and yet finding out actually the attributes of something begin to take on both physical and emotional meaning.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing, Selma. That's beautiful. And I guess now it's time
It's
to
very lovely.
take the questions. We already have a couple of questions here. The first question is from Lara. Do you think that contributed to the dismissal of intuition as a way of knowledge as well? Lara, do you think that poetry? I guess there's a missing word here. Lara, you may use your microphone. It's okay.
Hi, yeah. No, this was mid conversation about separation of the mind from the body. And so I thought of like intuition as being one of those ways of like knowing, where your body knows before you can put it into words, or before your mind processes like it. So that's why I was asking if you think that separation kind of contributed to the fact that nowadays intuition is not really considered like a reliable way of knowing.
That's a very nice question. Or is your question for anyone specific? Is it for Selma?
Yeah, actually, because she was talking about it, so that's why I was.
Okay.
Yes, Laura, I think that's a really important and interesting point, actually. And I think this is one of the reasons I was saying at the beginning of the talk, why it's important to question why we have this image word separation, and that bringing the understanding of the body and how the body works back in helps to give us a different understanding. And I think in the kind of modern world, and with the history of industrial revolution and the idea of science and rationalism and truth, things like instinct and intuition, which often come together in instinct and intuition, have been kind of sidelined as too feminine, a kind of woman's thing. You know, the saying woman's intuition, like men don't have intuition. And I think that it's something that is definitely present in instinctively and intuitively how we feel things. Like you said, we don't necessarily know how we know something. I don't know if it's happened to all of you, where you know you go to bed thinking something and you wake up and your mind has presented you with the answer without you realizing it, because a lot of the subconscious work, 90% I think or something of our brain activity, we don't know what it's doing. You know, you could say we're pretty clueless about what our brains are actually doing, and what our bodies are telling our brains and presenting our brains with. And people often think things like intuition is nonsense and instinct is nonsense, but actually it's learned responses, and your body has learned certain feelings and understandings about what something means, and smells that perhaps you haven't realized and noticed that are giving you a warning or an alert that something is wrong. So you may think it's some kind of wishy-washy subjective feeling that you can't explain, but actually there may be a very concrete physiological reason for why you're having an intuition about something. And I think that intuition is something that's very important, and instinct in writing poetry and creating art. You have to let go of trying to control everything. You have to let in all this chaos and subconscious and stop trying to control that. So I think that, yes, definitely the business of instinct and intuition, you know, it's a pity that people can't do kind of scientific studies about these things. You know, who will dare now to talk about premonition? You know, we'd basically be dragged off and, you know, cancelled on Twitter, you know, if we started talking about premonitions and things like that. But actually there, and you know, telepathy, who knows what scientific foundations and visceral and physiological things there are behind those forgotten and marginalized understandings.
Perhaps
I don't know if that helps.
quantum physics would probably come up with answers.
Yes, string theory.
Yes. All right, thank you so much, Selma. You have another question from Elizabeth McSkeen. Regarding Selma's observations about the body and metaphor, to what extent can the process of writing about music and especially dance create the dynamic of metaphor you referred to?
Interesting question. And funnily enough, when I used to, when I was a teenager and I would be drawing and painting, I'd be sitting on the floor, I always had music on. And going back to the question of, I mean, obviously this is a very individual question. Probably everyone has a different response and creation of metaphor for them through their understanding of the world from listening to music. I think it'd be a very personal kind of process. But part of when I started speaking, I was explaining about synesthesia, and one of the strange things that happens to me when I listen to music is I actually not only see but physically sense material sensations like wire or metal or silk or velvet or some other kind of strange material that I can't quantify. That listening to certain types of music gives me physical, visceral sensations of actual substances. Kind of suddenly, I mean, it's really hard to explain because I'm not just seeing them, I'm feeling them, and they're kind of being evoked by the music and the mood. And then sometimes that will create kind of scratchy drawings. Perhaps if I'm feeling wire or something rough and scratchy, then I'll end up drawing something very rough and scratchy. Or if there's a smoothness of flow and something velvety, then maybe it will create a feeling of movement. Or crescendo is often like increasing emotion or decreasing emotion, which takes me back to some of the things I said about ornament. You know, you look at lines moving, like from narrow lines getting bigger and crashing. So there's a lot of similarities between music and ornament and pattern, and pattern and sound. So I think that metaphorical process through the different sensations of sound, touch, and seeing are a really important part of a creative process.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you all for this very, very stimulating, interesting, enlightening, and thought-provoking discussion that we had today. Thank you so much. I greatly enjoyed it, and I'm pretty sure that the audience agrees.
I think Glenda.
Oh, there's one more question. I'm sorry.
Glenda is
anyway, yeah, we could still go until 7:30. So right, there's Stephanie. I see Stephanie and Hind. Okay, so Stephanie McCarthy, more of a comment than a question. I'm glad Selma has mentioned synesthesia and music, and the question of ornament and pattern are particularly important when singing traditional Irish music, for example. So would you like to answer the comment?
What, me?
Yeah, it's for you.
Yes, I think Stephanie is bringing up. Stephanie and I know each other quite well on social media, and we chat quite regularly on WhatsApp. And Stephanie sings beautifully Irish songs, and I think that yes, as she's making a comment that I totally agree with, and I think that without even understanding Irish, for me as a non-Irish person, maybe when you don't hear the lilts and the cadence and the emotional changes in your own language, perhaps it becomes neutral. So you have a sense that you're talking in a neutral way and someone else is. But for me, the Irish language has a musical element to it, and an up and down, and a feeling of sound that feels like music and movement and sensation as well. But I mean, I think that's something that we've also discussed before online with other people, that why are we forgetting that the human voice and an accent and how people speak with emotion and inflection is kind of taken out when you start typing words and things are in print and then things are online, then you're not hearing those things anymore and feeling them.
So true. I also agree with that. And
Glenda is saying she can't send her question. She's showing us a piece of paper with saying she can't send her question.
Yeah, sorry, let me put it back to gallery view so we can see Glenda. Oh, Glenda, okay, so you have a paper with the question on it?
She wanted to send her question, but she can't. Maybe she can.
Let me unmute you. Could you please unmute your microphone, Glenda?
Okay, will I just say my question? I don't know why it wouldn't go. It kept saying go to file. It wouldn't send.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
So it's in two parts. The first is the heart has been recently recognized as a state of intelligent consciousness with 40,000 neurons of its own, which makes it in effect another independent brain, as it can keep beating after the brain has died for a while. And trees have been found to have a collective neural network underground. So the question is for anybody, how does this change our sense of what our body is? And the second part is, what do you see as the impact of transhumanism and artificial intelligence on both our ekphrastic approach and whether or not AI is going to actually start writing all the poetry for us or instead of us?
Can I do the transhuman? Hi, Glenda.
Hi. How are you doing?
A long time no see.
I'm going to send you some ekphrastic folk poetry.
The transhumanist question, I don't think we've become fully human ourselves, yes, in relationship to the body and nature, and I could see just a whole mess of pottage there, and I don't mean to be too negative about it. I think the poems come from our embodiments, which includes the spiritual and our relation to the environment, and let AI try. But I mean, I think we have to resolve our relationship to nature and the body first before we start programming things to do it for us. And the first part of the question, I suppose someone else could take it.
This is whether our sense of our body is changed by the awareness that our heart is like another brain in our body, and maybe a more intelligent brain, maybe a more intuitive brain than this brain.
Well, body response is like we've heard about instincts and neural pathways and stuff like that. But I feel at the moment, because of the pandemic, that we're living in a state of like adrenaline and fight or flight. And I think it's putting a lot of pressure on people's body systems and their hearts. So I would say that that's stressful because body reactions too. And I think we have to find a way maybe to release the head and the mental reaction, and maybe start to rely more on the heart reaction to what we're seeing and experiencing, because people are in a constant state of daily and physical stress, and it's not good. So I don't know how to transcend that, but maybe if we focus more on the heart issue than on the brain and the rational issue, we'd have more of a decent chance of understanding the situation we've put ourselves in, rather than we have become victimized by we've put ourselves in this situation. Yeah. So I'd like to hear what other people have to think. Salma, because she's great on physiology. Thanks.
Well, actually, I was just really quickly, because I know we've run over, but I just wanted to say there's something called, I was trying to remember the name. So you have these things called proprioceptors in your body that throughout all your body, right deep inside. And you have, if you imagine using a pair of chopsticks or a needle, or having to use a prosthetic limb, or any physical object that you're using, if you use knitting needles all the time or something else, you begin to find that your sensations have extended outside your body into this thing that you're using, and you're no longer, I don't know if you saw, my husband popped in, so he's Chinese, and I've been using chopsticks to eat my food for like 25 years now, and I find cutlery really awkward. And I realized that when I'm using my chopsticks, I can feel, it feels like my nerves are now at the end of the chopstick, and I'm feeling these very tiny, fine sensations. And I think that people who have to learn to use prosthetic limbs, and all sorts of people who are using very complex or simple materials and tools, will understand this. And that, going back to Glenda's question, in this idea of industrial revolution and enlightenment, there was this idea that there was man and nature. But before that, in medieval times and in most other cultures around the world, there isn't man and nature. We are nature, and it's very wrong to think of ourselves as outside of nature. And going back to what Glenda said, if you start to think of yourself as a tree, we are more like trees. If you think about this external proprioception, where your body is able to sense, we were talking about touching. When you see an image or an object, you can feel that you're already touching it. And this is another kind of sense of experiencing a remote environment. So actually we are kind of dissolving all the time, constantly outwards into this world, intimate world that's around us. And we shouldn't really see ourselves as not nature. When people get, this idea that human beings are more important to save than all the animals on the planet. Well, sorry, no, I think we have to go, if we're going to choose. But yeah, so we're very much like trees. And AIs, I don't know about the AI question. Will the AIs start writing the poetry? There was this, there's a Russian drama on Netflix, that's called Better Than Us, and she is an AI who actually turns out to be better than us. She's more human, if we think of human as caring about people and environment, and she's stronger and she's better. So maybe they'll be better than us.
Well, we're not that great anyway, so
No.
I don't think that's a bad thing. All right, so it really saddens me to come to an end, to have to end this beautiful, beautiful session. I mean, we can simply go on and on and on for hours about this. It's been wonderful having the three of you, Chris, Laurette, and Selma. And again, I want to thank you all for being here. Stay tuned for more sessions like this. We have another session on the 20th. It's a similar ekphrastic session, but it's discussing the relationship between words and design. And on the 27th of October, we have a poetry open mic. So if anyone would like to give it a shot and show us their poetic expressions, feel free to be here. And you might just get a turn. So I hope to see you all again in other sessions and other episodes of Indelible Evenings. And I definitely look forward to hosting you again, Chris, Laurette, and Selma. Thank you again for this wonderful, wonderful discussion. And have a good night or a good day, depending on where you are. So
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
thank you
Rula.
all. Thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.